The next speaker is Michaelson, a doctoral candidate at the Department of Jewish Thought, Hebrew University, and the editor of Zeek, the Jewish Journal of Thought and Culture.
Thanks. I think I'm going to segue just kind of pretty smoothly, actually, from Mark's presentation, because for me, there's something really interesting happening in the Judaization of lawyer jokes, which is that it curiously doesn't follow demographics. There are other professions in which Jews are numerous, medicine, for example, and yet we don't find Jewish jokes migrating to doctor jokes. There seems to be something about the law that seems to be kind of Jewish, and that's what I want to take as my starting point. There seems to be something about the law as conceived of in this kind of American popular culture discourse that has some Jewishness to it, and that's where I'd like to begin. And by the way, I've been sequestered in libraries for the last few years, which is why there was sort of an enormous stack of paper with my name on it, but I'm not going to read even 1/10 of that amount in case you were wondering how I was going to manage to do it. I want to take that starting point of this ambivalence about the law. I mean, you may have noticed that Americans are a little ambivalent about the law. On the one hand, the rule of law is something loudly proclaimed, or we venerate our founding documents as much as our founding fathers. And yet, on the other hand, an increasing chorus of public figures, especially conservative ones, have decried the death of common decency in an age of bureaucracy and legalism, a litigation explosion that's destroying our nation's economy, and in general, an obsession with law, codes, and rules instead of authentic human goodness. Well, do we love law or hate it? And what are we really talking about when we talk about the law in this way? I argue, and I want to suggest that we're really talking about the soul, that this is a religious conversation. Our popular American legal discourse, born as it is from a strongly Protestant culture and out of centuries of ambivalence about the law, is primarily a religious one, enacting a sort of Kulturkampf between religion and secularism within the rhetorical context of the law. As we'll see, centuries of anti-legalism in the Anglo-American tradition reflect exactly the same ambivalence of our contemporary moment, simultaneously praising law writ large and denigrating actual written laws. True law in the anti-legalist tradition is that which enables common sense and basic human decency to prevail over codes, rules, and letters. True law involves the soul. Written law undermines it. And this may be very familiar for any scholars of religion because this is exactly what Paul, the founder of Christianity as we know it, said about the Pharisaic Jews, who maintained the legalism of the old Jewish covenant. For Paul, just as for today's critics of legalism, it's not merely that the letter of the law matters less than its spirit. It's not a jurisprudential question. Really, it's that the letter is dangerous because it corrupts the spirit both of the law and the souls of the people who adhere to it. Literal adherence to the law is at best unnecessary, at worst an obstacle to grace. And these are concerns about the soul. For Paul, influenced by Platonic dualism, the essence of the human being is the non-corporeal, immortal soul. And I'm not going to really spend much time with the counterexample. In the paper, I developed this at some length, and we heard a little bit from David Berger on this, that in biblical and Talmudic Judaism, there's not quite as much dualism. There's a little bit more play between body and soul. And I would argue that certainly the dominant strain within Talmudic legal, rather than the spirit, is the site of religious significance. We'll talk a little bit about circumcision, which is kind of the focus point of that debate. Old Judaism required circumcision of the flesh, but the new covenant, which talks about the spirit rather than the body, requires circumcision of the heart. Old law focuses on actions, for example, how one must treat one's enemies, law of war kind of questions. New law focuses on intent, that one should love one's enemies. Most importantly, old interpretations of Scripture were literal, new ones are spiritual. So I really just want to show three things. First, that this ambivalence exists in non-religious, ostensibly non-religious contexts. Second, that it has existed throughout our legal tradition. And finally, that it really is the same religious critique lodged in early Christianity against Judaism. So we're going to start actually from a recent point, the 1998 Clinton impeachment, but I also want to talk a little bit about juries in the common law, and then we'll look at Paul. Just two notes about two things I'm not going to argue. I'm not going to be able to prove a direct historical link from the Apostle Paul to George W. Bush. Sorry to let anyone down. I will observe the same religious argument recurring over and over at numerous points in history. And although it goes without saying that Protestant Christianity is important to American culture, only occasionally do contemporary figures make clear the religious genealogy of their opinions. Second, I'm not trying to say that people who dislike lawyers are anti-Semitic, or that critics of legalism are anti-Jewish. We're speaking not here of actual Jews and actual Judaism, but as lawyers typed as Jews, as law typed as Jewish. Obviously, many people without any bigotry whatsoever, including many Jewish people, hold anti-legalistic and anti-lawyer opinions, and plenty of racists and anti-Semites don't. Rather, the claim here is that anti-legalism replicates, in a non-religious context, ancient religious typologies and biases which reappear over and over again because they're fundamental to our nature as embodied human beings wishing themselves to be souls. I also am not going to make any comment as to whether more or less legalism would be a good idea in the regulatory state. The other paper in the stack there, In Praise of the Pound of Flesh, does make that claim and argues from a sort of postmodern perspective that a legalistic jurisprudence of the flesh actually offers more multicultural potential than a sort of I know it when I see it jurisprudence of the spirit. But that's the other paper, which I'm not going to argue now. When we Americans speak about the law, we're speaking about much more than the law. We're reenacting a religious dispute. The ancient question that if we're essentially souls and not bodies, what's the significance of the literal body-centered law, did not go away over the centuries. On the contrary, it grew so important and so central that we've learned to take it for granted. What we're talking about when we talk about the law is the soul.